Check, check. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Constitution series. Today we'll be talking about voting rights. My name is Megan Malloy, and I'm the local history librarian. And today we'll have David Bateman, who is an associate professor from Cornell at the Government Department, as well as the Jeb E. Brooks School of Public Policy. He's also an author of Disenfranchising Democracy, Constructing the Electorate, and the United States, United Kingdom, and France. We'll also hear from Tompkins County Elections Commissioners Alanna Congdon and DeWitt. Thanks to Susan Curry, Carol Kemen, and Stephen Yolor for their work. And the live stream will be available on YouTube. Come on up.
So can you hear me? Yes. Great. I'm going to start the timer. So when I was asked to give this talk, so I guess first off, I'm David Bateman. Very nice to have you all out here. When I was asked to give this talk, I thought, great, voting rights. This is my bread and butter. I know this area very well. And I thought it would be, pretty straightforward. And I sat down to write, and I thought, oh, what have I done? And I immediately got anxious. And because the story of voting rights in the United States is actually really extremely complex. And one of the things I've tried to do in my scholarship is say it's actually even more complex than you think it is. And I've also sort of taken a historical approach to it. And so I would sit down and I would think, all right, I'm going to write this one thing. And no, in order to explain this, I need to explain this other thing over here. Or for people to understand what's happening in the case that the Supreme Court heard yesterday, Louisiana v. Calais. Although I'm initially Canadian, so I'm never quite sure how French names are pronounced in the United States, especially in Louisiana. I'm going to say Calais. This is a case that the Supreme Court heard yesterday. And I was like, well, to let them know, to help them understand that story, they need to understand the history of the Voting Rights Act, the history of Reconstruction. And I kept getting anxious, and I started spiraling. And I eventually pulled myself together, and I decided I was going to tell you a story, rather 3 stories, which is probably too many, but it helped me sort of concentrate a little bit. These are stories that I have found useful for understanding the politics and the law of voting rights and how it got here. And so I thought it might be a useful way of structuring my part of the conversation before we turn it over to a conversation with the voting rights commissioners, or the election commissioners. All right, so my first story is about contradictions. The US has a remarkable history of simultaneously expanding voting rights at the same time as it is removing them or contracting them, of simultaneously making it easier to vote and harder to vote. For example, in the 19th century, the early 19th century, just as states started to remove or abolish qualifications that required voters to have property, it was at the same time that they put on new restrictions requiring that only white men could vote. At the same time, they expanded the electorate in one direction, they contracted it in another. Even today, we have seen a lot of states impose new voter identification laws, right, that are intended to suppress voting a little bit, although their empirical effect is not nearly as large as they anticipated. But these voter identification laws are going into place even as other states are making it much easier to vote. And so the United States is paradoxically, simultaneously the place where it is easiest in the world to vote and where it's hardest in the world to vote. And it depends where you are, who you are, what election you're voting in, and a variety of other things. So that's part of the complexity, but it's also the contradiction, right? We can do this, we can have this story of the easiest place in the world to vote, or one of the easiest places in the world to vote in some places, and one of the hardest places in the world to vote, or amongst democracies in the world to vote, in other places, because we have an extremely fragmented election system. I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute, but one thing I just want to flag is most elections, as we will hear, run usually at the county level. In some states, such as Michigan, they're even further distributed so that they're run largely at the local level. Michigan has 10,000 almost separate types of units running its election administration. Right? This is a high level of fragmentation. Right, so that's the first story. That's an easy one. Just keep this in mind, that we have these contradictions in our elections. That there's always been a simultaneous inclusion and exclusion, easier on the one hand, harder on the other hand, sometimes in the same place, sometimes in different places. My second story is a more regional one, and it's a bit more of a history. But this helps me get on the table some of the things I think are important to understand about how we have the voting rights regimes that we do in this country. And I don't mean anything sort of nefarious by regime, but political scientists often use the language to think about a type of way of how you approach a policy problem. And this is a story of a tale of two cities type, right? You know, it's the best of times, it's the worst of times. In my story, the juxtaposition is not between cities, but between regions of the country. So here's my argument. Voting rights came relatively easy to the north. They came extremely easy to the west. And they were extremely hard fought and hard won in the south. So you have not just this regional fragmentation at the state level or the county level, but you have three different regions of the country that approached voting rights in very different ways. All right, so what do I mean by voting rights came easy to the north? So let's go back to the period of the Revolutionary War. All of the American colonies at the time of the Revolution restricted the right to vote to adult men who owned property. During the Revolution, most states started to liberalize these requirements. They lowered how much property you needed. Some got rid of property qualifications and had tax-paying qualifications instead, allowing more men to vote. Well, why did they do this? Well, the United States was not a thing. Most of these people saw themselves as British in some way or another. As a Canadian, I have to remind you that this was a civil war and that half the country then left. Not half the country, but a big chunk of the country then left or stayed here but never really felt all that loyal to the regime, to the new country. And so they lowered voting rights because they wanted people to like the new country that they were creating. If you couldn't vote and the British came to you and said, why are you going to fight for these guys? What do they do for you? Well, you might buy that. So when it came time to write the Constitution, there was a lot of elite support for going back to more restrictive voting rights. A lot of elites in the country did not like how much they had liberalized voting rights during this period. But they also worried that if they tried to, in the Constitution, roll those rights back, that the people wouldn't accept the Constitution. And after all, there had just been a series of rebellions in Massachusetts and elsewhere, basically suggesting that actually people were not quite happy with this whole new government to begin with. All right, so does anybody know how voting rights were defined in the original Constitution? Before the 15th Amendment, before the 19th Amendment, or anything like that? Barely shows up. Here's the lines. The electors in each state shall have the qualifications requisite for electors of the most numerous branch of the state legislature. That's Article 1, Section 2. And then here's a sort of more wishy-washy one. I think it's important. We can talk about why I think it's important, but nobody else thinks it's important. And it was never historically important. The United States shall guarantee to every state a Republican form of government. That's Article 4, Section 4. I'm going to leave the second one aside because, well, I think it's very important. It's not a big part of our story. What does the first one mean? The first one means that the states decide on voting rights. So voting rights in the United States were decided at the state level. They were left to the states. All right, well, why? Other things were being moved to the national level. Most federal countries have national level voting rights. Right? When I was able to vote as a Canadian citizen, I've since become an American citizen, but when I was able to vote there, it was run by Elections Canada. It was a federal agency. The United States doesn't have really anything of the sort. It has a federal elections commission, but it's very, very different. It doesn't run the elections. There's no national voting right in the United States in that sense. Why? Well, northern colonies during the Revolution had gone much further than southern ones in expanding the right to vote. And as often is the case with American history, the reason for this basically boils down to slavery. Slavery made the different regional elites look at democratic politics a lot differently. Elites in the North were not happy with democracy. They were not thrilled by it. They didn't like it, but they could live with it. And they thought they could make it work, especially once they organized parties and stuff like this. They were okay with it. The elites of the South hated it. Now, they were okay with people voting, but they were fundamentally committed that it had to be the right kind of person. And that right kind of person was white. And remember, in the North, no northern state at this point excluded African Americans from the right to vote. So they had to be white. They also had to own a lot of property, at least the right type of property. And so just a few examples of this, right? All northern states at this time allowed black men to vote. New Jersey even allowed unmarried women to vote. So New Jersey, if you were an unmarried woman, either you had not yet married or your partner had passed, you were allowed to vote up until 1807. From 1776, at the Revolution, we need all the support we can get, people, to 1807, unmarried women could and did vote in New Jersey. Massachusetts required a very small amount of personal property, like a workman's tools would be probably enough to qualify you to vote in Massachusetts. It depended. There was a lot of discretion at the local level about what counted for the property, in part because it was all denominated in Old English pounds, but inflation had just destroyed the value of those. They didn't know what to make of this money anymore. Pennsylvania required only the payment of a very small tax that all adult men had to pay anyways, right? So you had to pay it, and in having to pay it, it was called a poll tax, which was initially a way of including people in the electorate. You had to pay it, and so you became a voter. By the contrast, the Carolinas and Virginia required ownership of relatively large tracts of landed property. So the problem that they faced was that any national qualification at the founding would either enfranchise way too many white Southerners and possibly even free black Southerners for the Southern elite to be comfortable, or it would have disenfranchised way too many Northerners for Northern elites to believe that they could sustain any popular support for the Constitution. And if it was applied only to federal and not state elections, right, you were going to have two elections operating at the same time in which 1,000 people might go to vote and 1,000 people can vote in one and only 600 in another. You know, the 400 who are excluded are going to be very upset with this, and it's going to be a lot of contention. And again, this is a point when no one's really that committed to the new country. They're still figuring it out. It's a pretty new thing. And so voting rights stayed at the state level. So this is how our first story about sort of this fragmentation, how we can have these simultaneous, different patterns came to be. We can have states acting very differently because voting rights were initially defined at the state level, and only the state level, and it was left at the state level and only state level. All right, so almost immediately after the Constitution, political parties are organized. You are familiar with political parties. All the founders who said that political parties are the worst things that you could ever possibly have, put down their quills and immediately organize political parties. They said, there's terrible things. Let's organize some. And one of the first things political parties realized was that they could win elections if they could change who could vote in those elections. And the Federalists tended to be more elite. They wanted higher property qualifications, but they didn't want to alienate people who, if there was a change in voting rights, they didn't want to alienate those people, so they weren't too restrictive on it. The Democratic Republicans, eventually would become the Democratic Party, wanted to abolish property and tax-paying qualifications. And competition between these parties eventually led to all property qualifications and most tax-paying qualifications being abolished in the North and the West. In the North, it was pretty easy. In the West, it was almost instantaneous, right? They enfranchised places like Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, the West at the time. They enfranchised all men before they had political parties. They even let non-citizen adult white men vote. This is something that we don't fully appreciate, that up until the early 20th century, many states allowed non-citizens who had declared their intention to naturalize, but who had not naturalized, the right to vote in state and federal elections. It was sort of a common practice. And nowhere outside of Rhode Island, and that's my little exception, Rhode Island's a weird place, but nowhere outside of Rhode Island was it violent, and there wasn't usually even a popular demand for it. You didn't need to organize to get the vote the way that they did in the United Kingdom or the way that they needed to do in the South. They just sort of got it. It was easy to get the right to vote. Both had a harder time. Right? It had a hard time enfranchising white men, and then it had a very hard time over the question of black suffrage. So before the Civil War, North Carolina had a huge property requirement. Louisiana required payment of a tax, but they only collected the tax on very large tracts of land and enslaved persons, so only the very wealthy were enfranchised through this tax. South Carolina went the other way, let all white men vote, but said only the extremely wealthy could be elected. So only about 500 people in all of South Carolina had the right to be elected. Anyone could vote, any white man could vote, but only a small segment could be elected. Virginia had property qualifications into the 1850s. Right? Even for white men, southern states were much less democratic. Right? Slavery generates huge inequalities in wealth, most obviously between slave owners and those who are enslaved, but also between slave owners and everyone else. And so the wealthy slave owners were very sort of concerned with this. And so Southern society has always been torn by two intense class conflicts. that between the slave owners and the enslaved, and that between slave owners and the non-slave owning whites. And this generated, in turn, a potential racial conflict between African Americans and whites. And so the South lags behind in democracy. It's only after the Civil War that we get the first creation of something that starts to look like a national voting right. And it's some weak stuff. Let me read to you the first moment in which a positive kind of federal grant of a voting right in the Constitution emerges. But when the right to vote, this is 14th Amendment, Section 2. But when the right to vote at any election for the choice of electors for President, Vice President of the United States, representatives in Congress, lists the various offices, is denied to any such state, being 21 years of age and citizens of the United States, or in any way abridged except for participation in rebellion or other crime, the basis of representation shall be reduced in the proportion which the number of such male citizens shall bear to the whole number of male citizens 21 years of age in such state. That's a very big mouthful. It is an extremely complicated section. It has never, ever been enforced and is frequently ignored and forgotten. But basically it says, this is the first time the federal Constitution speaks on the issue of voting rights. It says, yeah, you're allowed to disenfranchise men, but if you do, you lose seats in Congress and the Electoral College. That's it. And unless you're disenfranchising them on the basis of participation in the rebellion. Then you're fine. But any other reason, you lose votes in Congress and the Electoral College. That's it. That's the first protection for voting rights. It was never enforced, not once. There were various efforts to enforce it in the 20th century, early 20th century, never really got off the ground. It's still in the books. It's still technically part of the Constitution. The Second Amendment, however, is the more important one. It's the one we remember. It's the 15th Amendment. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So this is the first time the U.S. Constitution establishes a right not to be disenfranchised, right? The previous one was you can disenfranchise, you don't get the same representation in Congress. If you do, this says you can't disenfranchise. But you'll notice it doesn't say all citizens have the right to vote. It doesn't even say all male citizens have the right to vote. It just says you can't deny the right to vote on this specific grounds. You can do it on other grounds. You can do it on property qualifications or literacy qualifications or tax-paying qualifications. They don't say what you can do it on. They just say a narrow, small, you can't do it on this basis. Having started off by leaving the definition of voting rights to the states, the 14th and 15th Amendments didn't overturn that, although there was discussion of doing so, but just limited the reasons why you could exclude somebody. The 15th Amendment wasn't very popular in the North. New York State ratified it and then tried to rescind its ratification. And the federal government had to say, no, you can't do that, it's too late. That ship has passed. Most Northern whites didn't want to give black Northerners right to vote, but a majority of Northern whites also recognized that black voting rights were essential to securing emancipation and the results of the Union victory. And so it was pretty quickly accepted in the North, the 15th Amendment. It went into effect relatively straightforward in the North. In the South, it's an entirely different story. It's a generation of voter intimidation, overt violence, constant assassinations of political leaders. This is the period both during Reconstruction and after. That eventually culminates in a period from the 1890s to the early 1900s in which southern states successively passed new constitutions disenfranchising almost all black voters. The constitutions were carefully crafted not to violate the letter of the 15th Amendment. They did not say African Americans are not allowed to vote. They said a literacy test is required to be able to vote. And then the literacy test was administered at the local level in such a way that the only people who turned out could pass it were whites. Now, it was a lot more blatant than this, but they didn't put the blatant stuff down in the law. They just said it and then didn't write it. And so the Supreme Court could have thrown it all out on the obvious grounds that this is what they were doing. And so the Supreme Court had to throw logic and history out of the way to say it was constitutional, but they did. And so they said it was constitutional, and so the South ceased to be democratic states up until effectively the 1960s. All right. Still, voting rights continue to be easy in the West and the North. I'm not going to belabor the point too much other than it brings us to their next big amendment when it comes to voting rights. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. This is the 19th Amendment. This comes super easy in the West. The West, Wyoming gives women the right to vote early. Utah gives women the right to vote early. The federal government takes it away, the right of women to vote in Utah, because it was Mormon women, and they didn't want Mormon women having the right to vote. So they took the right to vote away from women there, but as soon as Utah becomes a state, they go back to, this was when they were territory, but as soon as they become a state, they go back to enfranchising women. The West goes easy for women's suffrage. The North has a harder time with it, and the South just rejects it altogether. If you look at the 19th Amendment of the states that ratified and refused to ratify the 19th Amendment, most of the states that refuse to ratify it are going to be in the South. All right, and so the last part of this story also comes to us from the South, right? The civil rights movement was national. But from the outset in the 1930s and 1940s, a primary goal of the civil rights movement was to democratize Dixie, right? To bring democracy to the Jim Crow South, which was not a democratic society or a democratic state. And so out of the civil rights movement come the 1957 Civil Rights Act, which is a very weak voting rights act. It's followed by the 1960 Civil Rights Act, which is an even weaker voting rights act. And then the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which is not primarily a voting rights act. It has some elements for voting rights. But it's primarily about segregation in public accommodations and conveyances and state travel. And then the big one, the 1965 Voting Rights Act. There's a series of constitutional amendments that come around this time, partly as a result. We have the 24th Amendment, which prohibits requirement for a poll tax in federal elections. After the Voting Rights Act, the Supreme Court, on the encouragement of Congress and the encouragement of the President, finds that you can't have a poll tax in any election. But that's not technically in the Voting Rights Act, nor is it in the 24th Amendment, which only prohibits it for federal elections. And then 1971, the right of citizens of the United States who are 18 years of age or older to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of age. This was initially in one of the amendments to the Voting Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act, when amended in 1970, required all states to lower the voting age to 18. The Supreme Court found this unconstitutional. And so states responded by saying, okay, let's amend the Constitution. It was a relatively quick amendment, right? It was relatively popular. It's been very, very difficult to amend the Constitution ever since, not as a result of that, for other things. But all of these, none of these ever establish a right to vote, right? They just limit the bases upon which you can be deprived of that right. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the Voting Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act, the most important thing to know about it is that it's national in scope. It prohibits literacy tests or other tests or devices across the country. It applies everywhere in that sense. Like I said, the poll tax is not in the Voting Rights Act, but the Voting Rights Act says that the Attorney General needs to enter into litigation to try to find that the poll tax is unconstitutional, which they did. These national protections emerged out of Southern conflict, and so they reflected the specific character of Southern conflict over voting rights. They are attentive to questions of race. They're not attentive to questions of party, and we'll come back to why that matters in a little bit. Very attentive to questions of race because that is the primary line of conflict over democracy in the U.S. South. Because things were relatively good and easy in the North and West, and I say relatively, Congress needed a way, however, to target those states that were openly defying the 15th Amendment. Oregon voting was pretty good. Why impose all of the regulations on Oregon? Now you say there can be no literacy tests in Oregon, and Oregon's fine with that. But in order to make sure that elections actually work, the federal government needed to do more. So what it came up with were Sections 4 and 5 of the Voting Rights Act. We'll talk more about Section 5 in a second, but Section 4 was just a formula. It said any state or jurisdiction that in November of 1964 included a test or device for the right to vote, or any state or jurisdiction where fewer than 50% of the adult population was registered to vote, had to get approval from a federal court or the Department of Justice before it could change voting rights requirements. You couldn't make any change to your election procedures from the times that a place was open to where it was, to drawing your districts, nothing, without pre-clearance from the federal government. That was what Section 5 and Section 4 do. Section 4 is the formula. Section 5 is the authority for preclearance. And that brings me to the third story. Whenever a new right is granted, neither the losers nor the winners pack up and go home. Instead, they turn their attention to questions of implementation. In the case of voting, this means everything from designing the ballot. Most of you probably remember the hanging chads. Ballot design matters. It means everything from designing the ballot to drawing the districts to counting the votes. And this is a pretty common pattern in politics. Imagine you want to pass a law providing universal health care. Let's say you succeed. All the various interests that oppose the law and have lost might now turn their attention to implementing the law and to shaping the regulations to make sure that, well, yes, they lost at this one level, but they might be able to win at another. They might try to win the defeat, if you think about it that way. And so too will the various groups that organize to push for the law in the first place. They'll try to make sure that the victory they won is a real one. So the fight continues, conflict continues, but on a different terrain. So imagine now that you've just won the right to vote. Well, you want to make sure that that vote is counted correctly, or that you're able to exercise that vote in practice, that voting places are not too distant, that they're open at reasonable times, that they don't just stop being open when African Americans show up because all of a sudden it's lunchtime at 3:30 p.m. And the flip side is that those who didn't want you to have the right to vote in the first place now want you to control the practice of voting, because that's just as important as the right itself. The right is meaningless if you don't have the ability to follow through. So the more the voting rights are expanded and secure, the more the focus seems to turn on how those votes are aggregated and how elections are administered. Aggregated simply means the unit for which the election is held, right? We're in Congressional District 19. If you're able to draw the districts, right, you can influence, this is gerrymandering, you can influence the outcome. And so if you were unable to prevent a new group from voting, well, one thing you might want to do is make sure you draw the districts. And how elections are administered is all the practical, critical stuff that we'll be talking about in about 4 minutes. From keeping the voter registration list, making sure the office has the ballots, that they don't run out of ballots, that they have all the names needed, counting the votes, certifying the vote count. So I'll give two quick examples of how, I'll give 3 quick examples of how this has played out, how the conflict shifts from one terrain to another. The earliest gerrymander that I have found in American history was an effort by the English Quakers in Pennsylvania to create a gerrymandered district that would weaken the influence of the Welsh Quakers. Right? It was an intra-Quaker fight. The English Quakers didn't like the Welsh Quakers. They had, unfortunately, to their mind, Welsh Quakers were able to vote. They didn't like this, and so they had to come up with a way to diminish their influence, and so they drew a district that put all the Quakers, the Welsh Quakers, into a single district. And the English Quakers were more distributed. So the English Quakers, though the same size, were able to elect more people than the Welsh Quakers. They shifted gears and tried to achieve through gerrymandering what they couldn't achieve through disenfranchisement. My second example concerns Jeannette Rankin. Does anybody know who Jeannette Rankin is? Is that name familiar? One hand. Who's Jeannette Rankin?
She was a member of the House of Representatives that voted against entry into both world wars, if I remember correctly.
That's right. She was also famous for one other.
First woman elected.
She was the first woman elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. And so she was a Republican from Montana. And so I say Montana, it's in the West. It had a relatively easier time with voting rights. Still, here's a way in which you can see that even in a place where it was easy, such as Montana at the time, there's always conflict. I had this a pamphlet from the Rankin campaign that I use in class. It has all the usual campaign stuff, what she promises to do, where she stands on the issues. It tells voters to vote for Jeannette Rankin, right? Straightforward stuff. But right next to that, it has an odd line. Look for the name Miss Jeannette Rankin on the ballot. If you don't see it, ask the judge of election. Well, why would it have that? Well, because opponents of women's suffrage, and certainly those who didn't want women to be elected to Congress, they lost that fight at one level. Women had the right to vote in Montana. But they controlled a lot of the counties that administered the election. And so they just simply didn't put her name on the ballot. That's an easy way to stop it. My third example comes from the Albany Democratic Party. Now, this is an example I've been told by sort of old Albany politicos. Whether it's true, I don't know, or whether it's just the type of lore that they like, but it's the type of lore that got around. Albany apparently used to use a voting machine that made a click if you voted for the Democratic ticket. But it was silent if it wasn't for the Democratic ticket. No, it wasn't like, some nefarious, it was nefarious. It just meant they didn't oil one and they oiled another, right? One gear versus another gear. So you pull the lever, you hear the click. Doesn't seem like a big deal. Of course, standing right outside the place where you're hiding and voting is the ward captain for the Democratic Party machine. And, here's a click. Well done, son. Here's a click. It doesn't hear a click. Well, that person might have a harder time getting various relief benefits, welfare benefits, or getting things done from the city or local services, right? So that was the type of problem that was sort of leveled out at the level of administration. This was the type of things people concerned about when they were concerned with fraud. I want to go to Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, right? So I mentioned Section 5 required all states or other subdivisions that were covered to get permission from a federal court. Why did they want that? Why did they require this high level of permission? It was because they had seen in earlier fights over voting, they had seen that every time you passed a voting rights legislation in the South, white supremacist Southern Democrats would respond by gerrymandering districts, by changing election administration. They had an infinite imagination when it came to finding out ways to prevent black people from voting, or if they couldn't stop that, to prevent their votes from counting or being effectively weighted such that they mattered. And so pre-clearance allowed the federal government to say, we are going to look and see at any change, any proposed change, what the impact of this would be to ensure that there's no discrimination on the basis of race. Since 2004, that section has been effectively dead because it requires the formula, or since 2002, because it requires the formula of Section 4, which the Supreme Court struck down in Shelby v. Holder. Yesterday, the court heard arguments in a case that threatens to overturn one of the last remaining protections of the Voting Rights Act that targets the South, but it's not exclusive to the South. This, in fact, one goes much beyond it. It's part of the national requirements. After black Southerners got the right to vote with the Voting Rights Act, Southern states responded by gerrymandering districts so that black officials could not be elected. And Congress responded by requiring states to draw districts that would give minority voters the opportunity to elect a candidate of their own choosing. The result of this is a so-called majority-minority district. These are districts drawn, and the sizes range between 40% of a minority population to 50% of the minority population. They are drawn deliberately in order to allow minority voters the opportunity to elect a candidate of their choice. Now, if you look at districts on the basis of various democratic qualities, they are oftentimes more democratic than others, small d democratic than others. They're more representative. They're oftentimes more competitive. They're not always more competitive, but it depends a lot on where you draw it. They lead to a closer congruence between the voters and the representative. The Supreme Court has long been a bit suspicious of these, but they're still legally required. They're suspicious of these because they require you, and this is the first thing you need to know about majority-minority districts, is that they require you to take race into account. Right? If you're going to draw a district that has a majority or an influential population of minority voters such that they can elect a candidate of their choice, you have to take race into account. That's the first thing to know about them. The second thing to know about them is that they are the single mechanism responsible for the increased representativeness of Congress since the 1960s. They have done more than anything else to achieve a level of parity when it comes to racial populations, racial and ethnic populations. I'll give a quick example of this. House of Representatives today, on the lines of race and ethnicity, is amongst the most representative institutions in the country. It is almost perfectly representative of the relative populations. The Senate is amongst the least. And the reason is because the Senate is a permanent gerrymander of the states. You can't redraw those. You can't create majority-minority districts. For the Senate, you're stuck with what you got. We're stuck with Delaware. Or Rhode Island. Right. In any case, so the Supreme Court is now on the verge of deciding that you cannot use race in a positive way to draw districts giving minority populations the ability to elect candidates of their own choosing. But because we don't have a national right to vote, but because the history of our voting rights protections is oriented very strongly towards race, because of it's coming out of these southern conflicts, they've also found that it's perfectly okay to gerrymander on the basis of party. Now, in many places, less so than it used to be, but still quite strong, and especially in parts of the US South, race and party are almost perfect correlates for each other. Right? All African Americans in the South are Democrat, that's an exaggeration. All whites are Republican, that's an exaggeration, but not a dramatic exaggeration. We're talking 85%, 90%. And so race and party are perfectly correlated, near perfectly correlated. You can't use race, even in a positive way, but you can use party. And so you can gerrymander in a way that concentrates black voters or reduces black voters' influence as long as you are doing so on the basis of party and not race, if the requirement for majority-minority districts is struck down. All right, I've gone 5 minutes over. I want to get to the conversation, but I also don't want to give people the wrong impression. The three stories I'm telling have actually a mostly positive arc. Things are, in every single register, a lot better today than they were 50 years ago. They're not necessarily better than they were 10 years ago, not on all dimensions. But things have generally got much better. Even when parts of the Voting Rights Act were struck down in 2012, immediate changes were administrative, but didn't result in mass disenfranchisement. There was no return to Jim Crow. Even voter identification laws did not have a huge impact on reducing the right to vote. Why? Because we have a much thicker jurisprudence, much thicker protections and organizations, a legacy of the civil rights movement in large part, that protect the right to vote. And for a variety of reasons, the protections we have in terms of election administration have gotten much, much better. Basically, since 2000 and the election debacle then, Congress has passed Help America Votes. There's been a growing professionalization in some dimensions of election administration. And it's probably the case today that the last 8 elections, the last 4 elections, maybe the last 2 elections, have been the best administered, fairest, with the least amount of fraud in American history. This is an extraordinarily positive thing. Right? We used to have a ton of fraud. We used to have the South, which was totally undemocratic. And we now have, almost everywhere, a pretty robust democratic system and a high level of election administration integrity. All right, so last thing I'll say is these protections emerged out of conflict, and that conflict continues. That's just the nature of democratic politics. And we saw this during the pandemic, when there was a massive increase in false claims of election fraud, with election workers being targeted and so on. Conflict at one level, if you lose at one level, you shift it to another. And the conflict can be happening at all levels. And so, we have protections. They might be weaker now than they have been in some dimensions, although not when it comes to election administration. But they emerge from conflict and they'll be sustained by conflict. All right, my apologies for going over, but let's turn now to the conversation. So I'd like to invite the two of you up, please. Alanna and Stephen. So I think we'll sit down here. And so we'll have a conversation for the next sort of 25 to 30 minutes, and then we'll open it up. All right, so my first question, Steve, what do you generally do before, during, and after each election to make sure they are run fairly?
Well, it's a year-long project. Everything, everything that we do in our office is governed by New York State election law. It is bipartisan. Our offices are staffed with an equal number of representatives of our Democratic Party and representatives of the Republican Party. And whether it's maintaining our voter database, working with people to let them know what they need to know to get on the ballot if they want to run for office, whether it's designing ballots, programming voting machines, handling ballots, counting ballots. It's all done in a bipartisan manner. And some of the, some of the things that we do are, a lot of what we do is open to the public. I mean, the public can actually see, that we are doing things, in a fair manner that, I don't know if we can ramble on, but, we put together this, there's a thing about, some people think that there's a lot of fraud going on in elections. And there's this brochure that's over on the table there that we put together that essentially shows how our office does everything. And we put in, the law puts it in, but we administer it to make sure that, like if you've got ballots out, on election day, ballots come back, there's a chain of custody. The bag where the ballots are in a bag. It's sealed. Seal number is recorded on a chain of custody report. Bipartisan team verifies it at the source. Comes to our office. Bipartisan team in the office verifies that the seal numbers are still the same. Nothing's been tampered with, and they're locked up in a room that has two locks on it, one for the Democratic Party, one for the Republican Party. Where our voting machines go to, same thing. Two locks to get into the building. And there's a chain of custody. Anytime that the voting equipment, vote ballots, anything of that really needs to be secured and traced, anytime it travels from one building to another within our office or from the polling place to our office, there's a chain of custody report that goes along with that so that we know that nothing has been tampered with. I don't know, you have some more questions?
Do you want to add to it?
No, we kind of worked on this together, so we put it together and then we,
Great.
yeah.
All right. That's a great overview of of the protections that are in place to ensure that there's no fraud. Who are the election workers? What do they do? Who are they, first off? Who administers this election?
So our poll workers are residents of the county. They have to be 17 years or older and a registered voter. We are always looking for them, so a little plug, if anybody wants to be an election worker, there's a sign-up sheet over there. And they typically are by party, but I don't have quite the luck that Steve has, so we have blanks and Democrats working for us too. But it is bipartisan, so they understand that they're representing the other party.
Yeah, one of the things that strikes me as initially non-American is just how much election administration in the United States relies on volunteers. And ultimately, one of the best sources of protection against fraud is the fact that the sincerity of the volunteers who run it.
Yeah.
It's very high quality. And so when you see these volunteers sort of pouring over, making sure they got it very right, it's quite reassuring.
Yeah, it's a very long day for them too.
So what is a poll watcher? I sort of move around here following the logic of the conversation.
Yeah, a poll watcher is a person that's designated by a candidate or by a political party that they can sit or stand in a polling place and observe what's going on. Fortunately, we don't have this happening in Tompkins County. I'm not aware of any case, but they could challenge the right if somebody comes up to the table to sign in to vote and they feel that they're not eligible to vote. They could challenge their right to vote.
And what happens then? Let's say I go to vote and I'm challenged.
Well, I'm not aware of a case where it's actually happened in Tompkins County, but the procedure in place is that the person that's making the challenge has to say why, and then the poll workers can question they put the voter under oath, they question them, and they can rule on whether or not the voter can vote or not. But if the voter insists that they're correct, what I believe happens is they can vote. I mean, but at a bare minimum, they can vote by affidavit ballot, and it can get, adjudicated by the commissioners at a later time, because we're not out at every polling place. So, fortunately, we, have not had that happen. And I've been a commissioner now 22 years, and I am not aware of any case where, we've had that happen in our polling place, even though you hear about it on TV in other states,
Yeah, I think it's just sort of another way of thinking about the levels of protection. So there's the protection so people can challenge, and then if you are challenged, you have additional protections as the voter to be able to either prove that you are, or to have the case resolved at a higher level. Right? So that this ensures that one of the many reasons why voter fraud just basically does not happen. All right. Why do you, on the topic of sort of voter fraud, moving to the elections that are most difficult to deal with, what are the most difficult to deal with elections? What keeps you up at night? When you see an election on the horizon, you go, oh, not this one.
Probably the ones that are the most difficult are the ones where the most people are engaged and want to take part in it. It creates a volume of work in our office, that is much greater than what it normally is. We work longer hours, and I think it's also the electorate sometimes is really amped up, and so we're dealing with people that are, really, really passionate about the election, and sometimes that overflows into just, coming into our office and asking a simple question. So I think, that's what makes, those are the tougher elections, the ones that have more interests and more participants.
How many voters are there in the county? Give me a sense of what it is, how many people you have to sort of keep track of, in a sense.
Well, as of last week, there were 60,713 active voters in the county.
So active voters. So
Active.
What is an inactive voter?
Somebody who might be missing something on their paperwork, like a signature or what else would be inactive?
Well, person moves and we get word that they've moved, but we don't know where they moved. They could have moved somewhere else within the county. They could have moved outside the county. So we make them we'll put them into inactive status and send a card to their last known address that we have, just in case they happen to be there. If they show up at an election, on November 4th, they show up at a polling place to vote. We just have to make sure they're in the right polling place for where they should vote, and they'll vote by affidavit ballot. And if we feel that, yep, we should count the vote, we activate them, count the vote, and so we, do that. But we can't activate them, or I'm sorry, we cannot make them inactive unless we have something, from the post office or that, we can document to say that we have lost track of this voter.
Yeah.
We can't just, say, well, that person, we don't know where they are, but,
Haven't seen them in a bit.
but if we don't have anything to document that we don't know where they are, then we can't make them inactive.
So this brings us to the question of registration. How late can you register to vote in New York State?
For this election, October 25th is the last day to register.
And that's for a new voter.
That's for a new voter.
New voter that is registering in Tompkins County, but actually if you are, they passed a law back in 2019 that said that, let's say you move here from Long Island.
Yeah.
You were registered to vote in Long Island. You come here and you show up on election day to the polling place and say, I want to vote. You can vote by affidavit ballot. Because you were an active voter there, they transfer your registration here, and they can count the ballot. That 10 days before is for really a first-time registrant in New York State, even though they're doing it in Tompkins County.
Yeah, that's not bad. So one of the ways in which I was talking earlier about sort of these different directions that states are going, some states have been going to requiring you, lengthening the amount of time that you need to register. Some states have done automatic same-day voter registration or a same-day voter registration. So New York State, since 2019, has moved towards a more liberalizing, making it easier for voters to register by having it closer to the date. Is that right?
Yeah. I mean, you can't show up on election day as a new voter, but in some states you can.
Some states, yeah. So when somebody comes to vote, what are the reasons why you turn them down? What happens? What is that experience like if somebody shows up and says, I would like to either vote or I'd like to register to vote, and you have to say no? What are the reasons for that?
No eligible voter should be turned away. The worst case scenario is you go to a poll site and let's say you're not in the poll book or you're inactive status. We would have you vote by affidavit. It would come back to the office. We would look at the information, and then between Steve and I, we would say whether that's countable or not.
Great.
So, I mean, we don't want our election workers turning anyone away.
Okay, fantastic. That's great to know. So we know how many voters there are in the county. We know the sort of process for registration. What's the division by party and non-affiliated? Or do you feel comfortable sharing?
Sure. The Democrats, there's 32,624. Republicans, there's 10,491. Conservative, there's 439. Working family, there's 445. And everything else, there's 16,714 as of last week.
And do you also administer the primaries?
We do.
Okay.
Yep.
And village elections.
And village elections? So you do it all?
And we work with the schools for their elections.
So I'm going to ask how to register to vote, and then I think we'll turn it over to the audience, if that's all right.
Okay.
So how do you register?
There's a couple different ways you can register. You can register in person with a form.
So where would you go in person?
You would go to 128 East Buffalo Street as of right now. Check back next month, might be different. And then you can vote. There's an online voter registration. There's a QR code over there if anybody wants to do that. You can register with DMV.
If you have a New York State driver's license.
Yeah. And then, am I missing any?
Download a form from our website, print it, they fill it out, get it to us. I can tell you, when I first registered to vote, and maybe a couple of other people in this audience, I had to go to the Board of Elections and register to vote there, or I had to go to my polling place. They had what they call fall registration days. You'd go to your polling place if you knew where it was, like 30 days before, and you would say, I want to register to vote, and I want to vote in this upcoming election. That was the only way you could do it. And then in the 70s, you know, you got it so you could mail your form in to register to vote, you know, and then it's just evolved, and now we're to the point where you can, you know, mid-teens of this century, you could do it if you had a New York State driver's license. Just in the last couple of years, it's been online, you know, you can do it online. And actually, from our administrative standpoint, that's our favorite way. I mean, you talk about the people that actually have to enter all the data into the voting machine. They love the online stuff.
I registered when I became a citizen. The League of Women Voters was there with a form, and they invited me to fill it out. It led to the sort of problem. I was becoming a citizen. It felt very formal, so I signed my name in the most formal way I could. And then when I went to vote for the first time, I did the thing I do, you know, if you're buying a coffee, I just scribbled. And they said, well, you're going to have to try again. And I tried again, and I got it. Yeah. All right, so I think we're going to turn it over to the audience now. Thank you, Alanna, Stephen. I really appreciated your insight. So let's turn it over. See a hand here.
Thanks very much for this. So the president has signaled his interest in canceling the next election. How would that work, given how much power is vested in the localities and the counties and so on? So how can the president just call them off?
Well, you know, I would say no. You know, who knows? But, you know, I think probably the one advantage you might have is that, like he mentioned, elections are really administered decentrally. It's not a centrally administered operation, and you know, it's at least administered at the state level, and then, you know, in our state we have, you know, we have boards of elections in each county, so it's really decentralized more. He was talking about Michigan. I don't even know how you handle 10,000 jurisdictions, but you know, so I think that's would make it difficult, I think, to do it, but, you know.
I think that's right. If you think about it, he would have no, I mean, obviously he has no legal authority to do it. But if you think about, let's say he said, we're canceling the elections. Well, Democratic states wouldn't cancel the elections. Republican states might, but then you're just losing Republican votes. So because of this decentralization, in a sense, and there's costs to that, it makes it very difficult. You can think about, even with the Electoral College, in 2020 when President Trump called and said, find me 10,000 votes, find me 10,000 votes. Well, one of the reasons why that didn't work is, one, there's actually a very thick administrative process. You can't just, those votes aren't on the floor, right? They're not somewhere you can just
It's not Tammany Hall.
It's not Tammany Hall. We are well past that stage now in terms of the quality of election administration. But even if you could find 10,000 votes in Georgia, that wouldn't have changed the election. And so that level of decentralization means it's very, very difficult to rig a national election. There are other things you can do. Those other things involve suppressing turnout through use of the military in cities, for instance. Right? Those things could work. Canceling an election, that seems unlikely.
Sorry, just a quick follow-up. So I think the intention has been to create chaos, declare martial law, so we can't have elections. Is that off the books?
So, I mean, like, constitutionally, it is off the books. Legally, it is off the books. For a variety of reasons, you know, the National Guard is in Chicago. The authority, or in a variety of places, the authority is dubious, but might be there. But elections still operate. Bureaucracy still operates. These aren't under martial law. In fact, there's no such thing as martial law in the U.S. constitutional order. There's the denial of habeas corpus, which kind of effectuates the same thing. But only Congress can declare that. And like, it has to actually have reasons, like an invasion or an actual insurrection. So, you know, we're in a world in which things change rapidly. The canceling of the election doesn't seem likely.
So if he can't cancel the election, can he cancel the results?
Turn it over to the two of you.
I would like to think not, but, you know.
Can you cancel the results? And just say, I'm refusing to accept the results.
Bravo.
Yeah, they're delaying. They're delaying with the case of the Arizona representative, but they can't delay forever without constitutional challenge. Now, maybe the Supreme Court's in the books. Supreme Court has not been a reliable, in the history of voting rights, has not been a reliable defender of voting rights. But again, it confronts the same type of thing. Let's say he says, well, we don't accept these results. Well, New York State's going to send its results to Congress. Pennsylvania, New Jersey, like a lot of Democratic states are going to send all their results to Congress. And so if Republicans don't, and they sit it out, well, then they lose. The flip side to that is, well, let's say the House of Representatives doesn't choose to count the votes correctly. They could do that, but it wouldn't be legal. And everybody would know it. There is a type of degree to which the type of, we stole this election, but we stole it right, doesn't work anymore. We're in too thick of a legal world here for that. That doesn't mean that people can't steal things, right? Study authoritarianism and democracy. People do steal elections around the world. It's very difficult to steal elections in the United States because of the decentralization. And it's very difficult to do so in a way that you can persuade anyone that it was not stolen. I guess that would be my response to that.
What about what's taking place with the Voting Rights Act? We have a very, the Supreme Court is turning everything around. So if you're going to lose a certain group or groups of people, how is this going to affect things?
So,
Good question.
yeah, so the Voting Rights Act, remember, it has various national protections that have never been called into question. Maybe the Supreme Court will say, literacy tests are fine again, but that would be a huge shock. And even still, we're not the same country that we were. Even in the 1960s, the level of literacy was much higher. The literacy was much higher. So these things matter, but it's difficult to envision a world in which you go back to the pre-1960s era. That doesn't mean that you can't do sort of voter suppression on the margins. You can do voter suppression on the margins. And the more the legal constraints on how you do it are removed, the easier it is to do. But still, even with something like voter identification laws that were rolled out since 2008, which were sort of intended and often described by the people who were passing them as, well, this will help us win Pennsylvania because it'll keep people away from the polls. Like, they've had very small effects. 1 percentage point, tops. Now, 1 percentage point is the difference in a lot of elections, so it's tough to tell.
So, is it still true that convicted felons cannot vote? They lose their right to vote?
Tell us about New York State.
In New York State, if they're incarcerated, and they're convicted felons, they cannot vote, but if they're, I believe I got this right, if they are out of the, like if they're on parole or, have served their time, this is New York State now, they are eligible to vote and they can register.
So can Donald Trump still vote?
If Donald Trump were to vote in Florida, he'd be able to vote in Florida. If Donald Trump were able to vote in New York State, he were voting in New York State. But if he votes in Florida, I'm not sure. Legally.
The other question.
Felons have the right to vote in Florida.
I'm pretty sure they don't. So this is, the United States disenfranchises a strikingly large part of the population, primarily through felon disenfranchisement. There's some deliberateness. There was a little bit of sort of deliberateness about how states used to disenfranchise. If you, for instance, were engaged in election fraud, then you lost the right to vote. After the Civil War, a number of states said any felony. But there still were very, very few people convicted of felonies up until the 1970s through 90s when the carceral state exploded. The standard around the world is that you do not lose voting rights other than for specific political crimes. So if you were convicted in Germany of stuffing a ballot, then you might lose the right to vote, but only for a limited amount of time. Maine allows prisoners to vote, so incarcerated populations are able to vote in Maine. Florida is the other extreme. You have served your time, you're out. It's extremely difficult to be re-enfranchised. In some states, prohibit altogether.
So one wonder is your flyer says that voter fraud is nearly non-existent in our state. Can you comment on why you think that is the case?
Why it's what, the case?
Why we are so low in voter fraud?
You know, frankly, I wouldn't be surprised if it's low across the country. You know, from what I see or hear, elections are, I think, you know, I really can't speak from knowledge on it, but personal knowledge, but I tend to think they're probably administered very well across the country. I'm sure there's, you know, definitely some people that could tell that from personal experience, but you know, it's just the way that, you know, we do our jobs to make sure that, you know, everything is accounted for and it's transparent for the most part. People can, watch, what we do. I mean, it's very well constructed, the way we administer our elections.
Now to add to this, so political scientists have studied this and looked for voter fraud, and they find virtually none, statistically zero, right? And you know, the occasional cases that they do find are not deliberate, malicious occasions. There's somebody who tried to vote in the wrong place, thinking that they lived there. Or there's a few other cases. There are tiny amount of people where it's like, well, I'm voting on behalf of my mother who has dementia, but this is what she would have wanted. But these are very, very few, and not coordinated and malicious, right? In order to actually affect the results of an election through something like voter impersonation, you need to have a lot of people do this. A lot of people who are all of them legally exposed. That type of coordination, that doesn't happen. Right?
Voter disenfranchisement does happen, and that is fraud. I mean, look what happened in Georgia when Stacey Abrams was running. They disenfranchised, what was it, 50,000 voters? Just took them off the rolls. That's fraud, in my opinion, but it's not the way, it doesn't have anything to do with how you run the elections. It happened beforehand.
Yeah, so we should distinguish between various types of malfeasance. Voter fraud usually refers to election or individual impersonation, voter impersonation. It's, I go and I am pretending that I am somebody else, or that I have a right to vote when I don't have a right to vote. That, vanishingly rare for all sorts of reasons. What you're describing is a type of election administration malfeasance. But not even election administration malfeasance, it's really just voter suppression, because it's happening not at the level of administration, primarily, but through directed changes from the top. Now, even those, however, right? So, one of the things about voter rolls, and I would love to hear your thoughts on this, is that they are very difficult to maintain. And so maintaining accurate voter rolls takes a lot of work. So every state at some point has to purge. Now, when Georgia purged from the voter rolls, there was very, very few people who, as a result of that, could not vote. Because most people who were purged either had already left the state, had passed away, that they were sort of legitimate purges. So this is one of the reasons why, even in the Stacey Abrams case, which was probably one of the stronger cases for actual voter suppression mattering because of the narrowness of that election, there's very little evidence that it did. And so one of the messages I want to sort of reinforce is just that there are definite people wanting to rig American elections, but the structures in place to stop that from happening are actually really quite robust. It is very difficult to just go through and just sort of this person, this person, this person, this person look like Democrats. Or Republicans. There needs to be reasons. So even in that case, there's very little evidence that it mattered. That would be my response. I think the country is on the road to authoritarianism, but I think it's not happening through voting. But so I would love to hear your thoughts. So what is it like to keep this is kind of to keep track of the voters. Is it difficult to keep the voter registration up to date if people leave the city, pass away? What are the procedures in place so that that gets updated?
We can only purge a voter if we get a record that they've died.
Yeah.
We get a order from a judge that the person has been convicted of a felony. We also can purge them if, once they are in inactive status, they go 2 federal elections without voting, we can then purge them. But, you know, in those cases, you know, obviously if you die or you're convicted of a felon, it's difficult to re-register. But if you get purged because we lost track of you and you went 2 federal elections, you can register to vote again if you show up.
So this is one of the other reasons the purges, while they can make it more difficult, they don't always have the intended effect, largely because the people who are not willing, who are just uninterested in voting, wouldn't have voted anyways, and so it doesn't change the result. So the value of doing it is relatively low. Whereas the people who wanted to vote, well, it's not too difficult for them to get back on, even after they've been purged. Now that varies a lot by state, right? Minnesota's very easy to vote. Mississippi, it's very, very difficult to vote. If you move from Minnesota to Mississippi, let's say you're a relatively low propensity voter. You don't vote very often and you're in Mississippi, and you move to Minnesota. Relative to Minnesota, you will still be a low propensity voter. But you'll vote more in Minnesota than a high propensity voter does in Mississippi. It shifts, it changes your behavior. And vice versa. If you're a high propensity voter in Minnesota and you move to Mississippi, you'll still vote as often as you can, but the burden will be a little bit higher, and so the structures in place to encourage people to register, to make it easy to register, to encourage people to turn out, that sort of falls apart. So does your office try to encourage turnout at all? Or is that seen as outside the...
It's really outside of, you know, I mean, we definitely facilitate it, you know, so that anybody that wants to vote, you know, we do everything we can to facilitate them being able to register to vote. And of course, that's becoming better and better now with online voter registration. And we really try to make sure they know where they should vote. And, you know, we train our poll workers so that they know how to handle most situations if a voter comes in and they're not on the rolls. But we do, everything we do is, I think, to really make sure that anybody that is eligible to vote, wants to vote, can vote. And, you know, from that standpoint.
Yeah. That strikes me as the right balance, right? Like, you facilitate voting, but you leave it to the voter to decide whether they want to.
Just an almost technical question. How can we be assured that our votes are private? How does it work? Is there a record somewhere of who we voted for? Or is that somehow erased at the moment that you vote?
Well, we issue, you know, every ballot that we issue is unique. And, I mean, I'm sorry, they're all the same from, you know, but when you vote it, they are, you know, you cast it, we don't know who cast the ballot. And I suppose there are situations if you're the only person that votes in a particular jurisdiction, you know, there are several ballot styles. Like if you go to early voting, you know, you got, this year we got, I think, 26 different ballot styles because you have 9 different towns, you got 5 different wards, you got 16 different legislative districts. So if you happen to be in some little sliver unique thing and you vote and you're the only one, which I don't think there's that situation around right now, then maybe somebody could figure out, if they figured out that you voted.
If there's only one vote cast for David Bateman in an election.
Yeah, but we are, you know, sworn to, you know, secrecy on that. We can't divulge, I mean, we can divulge the results, but we can't say, well.
So does the ballot, does it have a name on it? Does it have your name on it?
No. We do get, you know, back when we used to count absentee ballots after the election, you'd get people that would sign their name on the absentee ballot. And we'd have to toss it, you know. And you know, and unfortunately, I think they thought they were supposed to assign it. But yeah, there's generally no way we can tell who cast a ballot, though. I don't, you know, it's, they're not tied to a person.
But there is a list, like if you have primaries, there is a list of people who voted in a primary,
Yep.
which
Oh,
is public
yes.
information.
Whether or not you voted is public.
yes, that is public.
That surprised me when I was helping somebody get elected locally, that I had this whole list of all these names that voted, you know, by party, and that
With-
surprised me.
With the United States, I just want to sort of highlight, is really unique in a variety of ways. Unique is one word I use. In having its primary processes run by public, by the public. And so this requires stuff like registration vote, of how you register in a party. And it's a public choice, a public record of you registering in a party. And this always struck me as very odd. But if you think about it, part of the reason for this is that it's very odd to have primaries in the United States, or to have primaries at all, I should say. Primaries in the United States is a pretty weird institution. Now, why do we have a primary? There's good reasons and bad reasons, but imagine you live in a place like Ithaca, which is pretty democratic, right? Not exclusively, but we saw some numbers.
Yeah.
And so every election is going to be a Democratic candidate wins, Democratic candidate wins. And so one of the attractions of primaries was that you would have choices even in places where there was a dominant political party. All right, well, then this raised the problem of, well, the party, if it's running its own election, the way a club might run its own election, could then just totally rig the votes. And so there was an additional, in the same way that there was sort of the follow-up to move to another level after you got the right to vote in a primary, you had to get the right to have that primary be administered in a way that people could trust. And so it became a state function. So parties, political parties in the US kind of became like public utilities, like regulated like public utilities. And this mattered a lot historically because it was that making them public is the mechanism by which the restrictions against African Americans voting in primaries was struck down. As long as the Democratic Party was a private club, it could restrict membership to whites only, except for that the Democratic Party's elections, primary elections, were all run by the state of Georgia. And so it was a public utility, it became public, and so by that virtue, African Americans had to be included.
But in other states, I lived in Virginia, you could vote across party lines in a primary.
Yeah.
Didn't matter what.
Yeah, so
party
some
you
states have
belonged to.
decided how to organize their primaries variously differently.
Every state.
Although I bet you, if you look at the map, you'll see that the South looks different than the North, looks different than the West.
Absolutely. But still,
Yeah.
compared to here,
Always.
you know, in New York, you need to register in a party, but like I say to people, go do what you want in the general election.
It was, and it hasn't gone overboard. Now let's go here.
Me?
Please.
So I know that the feds, this administration, is trying to collect personal data on everybody who votes. They want to do a centralized database, if I'm understanding correctly. And I'm just wondering how that's impacting New York, and what are our discussions about that? I mean, I'm assuming New York is not cooperating, but I know there are some states that are.
Yeah, we haven't, at least not in Tompkins County, we haven't had any requests or FOILs for voter information. I know the state, I think, has had, New York State Board of Elections has, and they, with a bipartisan board, you need both parties to agree to release that information, and at this point, they're not agreeing to release that information.
Go ahead.
I got a comment to make. It's more, not even a question, but I think the biggest threat, people here are concerned about cancellation of elections and so forth. I actually live in Texas, I'm just here visiting. So I can tell you where I live in Houston, they just eliminated a district, right, a minority district in the city. So what I would like to say is I think the biggest threat here is redistricting. And this case that's in front of the Supreme Court right now is being heard, and what I can read, if that doesn't go the way the Democratic people wanted, the Democrats wanted, I think you can vote, but it's going to be a permanently rigged system. There's going to be red states and blue states.
This has been a long problem. Gerrymandering's always sort of been with us. Like I said, the Quaker example comes from early in American history. Gerrymandering did become more common in recent decades, and for three reasons. One is that the one person, one vote decisions of the Supreme Court meant that states had to redraw their districts more regularly. It used to be the case that states would just not draw new districts. And if they got a new district, they might create an at-large district. So there'd be 6 districts, and then there'd be one for everyone. And so they just didn't need to redraw those districts. After one person would vote, they have to redraw their districts. 2, elections started getting a lot more competitive. Most of American history we don't appreciate is not a two-party system, but a 1 and a 1.5 party system. Like there's a big dominant party and another party that occasionally wins but doesn't usually, and it's not really competitive. The Republican Party did not believe, for instance, that it could win in Congress, certainly not the House of Representatives, from basically 1954 until 1994. And it was just like it didn't even pretend that it could win. So you look at the Republican Party in the 1960s and 70s, they're not planning on winning. They might want to win the presidency, they think they can win the presidency, but they don't think they can win Congress. And so there's no incentive to gerrymander for them. Elections have become a lot more competitive. Every election since I lived in the United States, which is go back to 2005, and every election before that up in, the Clinton years are weird because of Ross Perot. But like 2000 on has been thin margins with the exception of 2008, which was kind of a landslide, as close as we get to. And we have new mapping technologies that allow you to do it at a fine-grained level. We now know, it used to be the case that we would know how many people live in a county, how many Democrats there are in a county. You can now, through private information, other sources, some aggregating public information, get a pretty good sense of exactly what block people live in. So you can gerrymander a lot more. But this goes back to the story of what's protected and what isn't. Right now, we have a requirement that you cannot pack African Americans into districts in order to weaken or dilute their vote. There's no protections for parties. You can do the exact same thing, and as long as you use the language of Democrat while doing it, it's legal. The Supreme Court played around with various ideas for how it could act on this. It said initially at one point, well, there's no social scientific way of knowing what a gerrymander is. And the Supreme Court standard for a gerrymander was at one point, it looks bizarre. Never judge a gerrymander by looking at it. People aren't polygons. We live in weird places, right? The only way you can tell gerrymanders is by looking mathematically at whether or not it wastes votes. It's not whether you look at a map. So eventually political scientists produce all these new ways of saying this is a gerrymander. This is our measure for gerrymandering. We sent them to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, we didn't mean it. And then said it's just not a justiciable question. This is a serious issue. However, there's also problems to it. There's dangers to it. It's very difficult to gerrymander partisan majority without putting that partisan majority at risk in case of a landslide. So, Texas, I'm going to make up some numbers here, so I'll use the example of Texas, right? Let's say Texas is 52% Republican and 48% Democrat. Right? In that world, like if you just drew districts fairly, there'd be 52% would be Republican, 48 would be Democratic. Let's say you want to get 100% of those districts be Republican, or 90% of those districts being Republican. Well, you got to start spreading Republicans pretty thin, because of the way people live. It's going to be tough to have every district look exactly like the state. So what happens if let's say you get to a situation where you've drawn these districts such that every district has 52% Republicans. Well, the danger is if there's a swing towards the Democrats, you lose all the seats. Now, this is one of the constraints on gerrymandering. This is one of the reasons why, even when they try to go as hard as they can to gerrymander, they don't usually go and get everything. Because if they try to get everything and get greedy, it can overwhelm them. But they've been able to get around that constraint more and more by better mapping technology. Still, it is a constraint.
Are there any elections in the United States where non-citizens can vote on a local level?
The United States lags behind much of the world here, but there are places in the United States where non-citizens can vote. I don't have the list off the top of my head. There's a few places in Maryland, I believe. San Francisco, I believe, as well. Like I said, it used to be quite common that non-citizens could vote in state and federal elections, provided that they had declared their intention to naturalize. They didn't follow through, but they just need to have declared their intention to naturalize. We got rid of that in the 1920s, largely as we were expanding the right to vote for women, right? These things. There's sort of an inclusion-exclusion dynamic. There are a few localities, not many, and I don't think any in New York State, but I could be mistaken.
I'm aware of.
The school boards are another one, right? Whereas in Europe, for instance, all EU citizens, regardless of what country you're in, can vote for local elections. So if you are Dutch living in the United Kingdom, you can vote in a local UK election. You can't vote in a national UK election. So the US lags much of the world on this. But that raises an additional administrative question, because it was tough to keep track of where people are registered. Keeping additional track of who is a citizen and can vote in this election but not that election adds in another layer.
I just want to ask about absentee voting.
Yes,
we live in two different places, and so sometimes we can't make it back to vote. And I was in the military, and we would send them in. And I thought they were never really counted, because they don't count them until after they decided the election and announced it. Is there a concern that absentee ballots are not counted?
All ballots that are voted are counted. So, and now, I mean, up until 3 years ago, in New York State, we never counted the absentee ballots until after the election, and that's where I think that idea came from. But now, within 4 days of us receiving an absentee ballot from a voter, we have to rule on whether we're going to open that, count that ballot. And if we're going to count it, we immediately open it and prepare it for scanning. So we have, and the first scanning that we're going to do for this election will be the day before early voting starts, October 24th. But there's a whole bank, we have a whole bunch of ballots that are out of their envelopes. We still have the envelopes, but they're out of their envelopes, waiting to be scanned. And so they're going to be all counted before the election, you know, and then we do another count on ballots that we've gotten. We do the day after early voting ends, day before election day. And then we do one post-election scan, which would include all the absentee ballots that come in at that point, and plus the affidavit ballots that we ruled that we should count. They'll be put in there.
I want to sort of clarify something. We often think, you know, if an election is held on November 7th, we think that the election ends on November 7th and that the votes are final on November 7th. It's never been the case. The votes are final when they have been fully counted. Now, the reason we call the election that night is we usually know the result. But the numbers that are presented at the end of the night are almost never the same as the final certified numbers. And it's the certified numbers that determines who wins. This usually doesn't matter, because usually there's not enough ballots still waiting to be counted, not enough absentee ballots for it to matter. But you'll notice, like, when there are really close elections, it drags on for a long time because they got to count those, and jurisdictions are entitled to count them or prepare the counting in different ways. In Pennsylvania, you might remember in 2020, Pennsylvania took forever. It seemed to sort of take weeks to get. In large part, this is because Pennsylvania local administrators had not been entitled by law to do any of the preparatory work that Stephen just described, of getting these things ready, getting them prepared so that as soon as the election day hits, you can sort of count them. Instead, they had to wait until election day was done and then start opening them and do all that work. So that's why it took so much longer. And because that was the year where they had dealing with so many mail-in votes for the first time.
I was wondering what you all think about ranked choice voting, and if it results in candidates winning that represent better the populace who are voting for them. Do you have any opinions on that?
Yeah, I don't have enough experience. I know that New York City does it for primary elections, and I think they originally decided to do that because back when they instituted it, primaries used to be in September, and if they had to have our primaries used to be in September up until 2019, and 2019 it switched to June. But I think when they instituted ranked choice voting in New York City, it was still in September, and they had a thing where you had to have, I don't know if you had to have a majority. I think you had to have a majority to win the primary. So if they didn't have a majority, they had to have another primary election. And so the ranked choice voting eliminated the need to run another election. And so so that's how they use it there. But, you know, I don't know. I really don't know what happens if you put ranked choice voting, if it makes any, I tend to be skeptical because if you look at Ithaca, you know, I did an analysis a year ago, and I think over the last 20 years, in all the primaries we had 3 primary elections where the person didn't get a majority of the votes that won. You know, they got less than 50%. And we just had a primary in the 13th district here where the winner got 49.6, you know. But, you know.
From a political science perspective, there's a variety of ways of thinking about how you could achieve how you could structure elections differently. And ranked choice ballot is one way. The idea there being that it will allow people to express various types of preferences and intensity of preferences. And intensity matters. Other places have done, so France famously does a runoff, right, to make sure that somebody gets over 50%. The presidents, if there's a first round, if nobody gets over 50%, then they have to have a second round. That is, for the most part, the Supreme Court has not ruled that illegal, but it has a suspect history in the United States because the primary reason for doing this was to ensure that African Americans can never win Canada at a statewide level in the South, so that was one of the reasons it was liked there. It would always allow white voters to coordinate at a second round to make sure that they get their candidate. But there's other ways if you want to think about changing the electoral system, which I think Americans should think about changing the electoral system, not because they should do it, because it's good to have imagination. There's various ways of sort of proportional representation, of structuring elections differently. There's a whole literature and a whole world of opportunities. I don't think ranked choice will likely have the outcome of sort of reducing polarization or something like that. In large part because, you know, figures who are seen to be polarizing their parties and pulling their party to the left or their right tend to be popular in their party. And they win because, you know, they win because they're a progressive Democrat or they win because they're a firebrand Republican. And so they get majorities. And even if they didn't get majorities, the second round would probably bump them up even more. So it won't have that impact. I think it's a good idea because I like people to be able to express as much choice as possible and intensity of preferences, but it probably won't do much in terms of depolarization.
Maine has ranked choice voting.
It does have ranked choice.
And I think Alaska has as well.
I mean, personally, I think the reason ranked choice voting is important is if you see the 2 major candidates who are not expressing your opinion and you vote for that third candidate, you're considered like you might ruin the opportunity for your party's candidate to win. And so that's what you were just talking about, the parole election.
The parole election, we never know.
Yeah, and let's talk Ralph Nader, you know, let's talk, yeah.
I think that's right. So, ranked.
For that reason alone, I think ranked choice voting is important because our parties need to know that they have members who don't agree with their platforms and want to be going this way or that way.
I mean, and so I think that's right. Ranked choice voting isn't going to do much for depolarization. It might encourage the formation of additional parties, third parties, but there are other better ways to encourage multi-parties. And so if the United States wanted to move to a multi-party system, which I would very much encourage, but does require very big structural constitutional changes, because the presidential election system is like oriented towards two parties. Like, it pushes you there, funnels you into two parties. I like multi-party systems. A lot of people don't, but I'm a big fan. But there are better ways of achieving it than ranked choice voting. That doesn't mean that ranked choice voting is not perfectly appropriate, but it's worth thinking through, what is the goal here? If the goal is depolarization, it might not matter much. If the goal is additional parties, there are other ways to do it. If the goal is just to allow an expression of voter intensity, but otherwise we have more or less the same two parties, it'll work for that very well.
You have to take the money out of the system. That's the crux of it all.
There's a whole, that's a whole other debate. So, what time are we going to? I thought I had that written down.
8 o'clock.
8 o'clock, okay.
You have to be out of the building.
So we get thrown out of the building. We're not going to lock you in here. You're going to talk about voting until we leave. Are there any other questions? Please.
So if Trump did start a war before the next election, would that cause a pause in a new election?
We held elections in 1864. Even if there's a considerable amount of conflict in the US, which is not off the table, at the very least we have a tradition of holding elections when those elections are scheduled. And part of the reason for that, especially when it comes to the presidential election, is one thing to, if there's a massive, if there was a huge environmental disaster in a place like Rhode Island, and it hit all the state all at once, it wouldn't be difficult to imagine the state legislature changing the date with everybody to agree to change the date on when it's going to happen, right? The presidential election, that's set. It's going to be very difficult to get people to change that. And that's why we've kept at it. So we had a civil war, and in the midst of that civil war, we had an election. So I would anticipate that elections go forward. That doesn't mean I think that elections are going to be on a fair playing field. I don't think that Trump's going to be at the level of administration. Election administration is extraordinarily robust. And even in the United States, it's very robust. If you look across the world, authoritarian countries, a lot of them have in fact, improving election systems. Turkey, for instance, is an authoritarian country, but its elections actually are pretty good, pretty well administered. It's not the elections, it's not counting the votes. It's the level of pressure on civil society, turning civil society and the media organizations into arms of the party. That's how the election atmosphere is rigged there. But it's not at the level of rigging votes. That's my thought. Do you think if there was, do you have contingency, maybe instead of the Trump scenario, what are your contingency plans if there is a tornado in Tompkins County on voting day? Do you have contingency plans?
Well, 9/11 was a primary election day in New York State.
Wow.
And we actually, we were to open the polls at 12 noon, and when we opened them at 12 noon, up here, down in New York City, a little different story, but, only the governor can cancel the election. And what they did is they postponed it at about 10 after 12. They gave us the order to close down the election, and that they would rerun it in 2 weeks. So we, had to, close down the election, reset all the machines again to 0 because they were the lever machines, and
Did the governor need approval or support of the Board of Elections, the State Board of Elections?
No, it's the governor's call. And I'm sure the State Board of Elections does a lot of the coordination there. You had Hurricane Sandy back in 2012, I believe it was. Yeah, presidential Hurricane Sandy really did some slowed things down, made it very difficult down in New York City and Long Island. And they put in some last minute changes to, make it, dealt with absentee ballots. If you were a first responder, you could vote anywhere in the state, and they would count it rather than having to go to your polling place. But yeah, it's really done, when you get the situation, we have, contingencies if there's a power outage or, how we deal with things, or if we have to move a polling place. Last year we had a person that drove into the side of a polling place. We had to move it, right here in Tompkins County. And,
That was not on the election day, right?
That was on election day. That was on right at like 12 noon.
Was that deliberate?
It was an accident, but luckily we were prepared, and the sheriff's department was able to ascertain within 10 minutes that it was not, a bad actor doing something, that it was actually an accident. So that gave us a lot of relief. But then it still took about an hour to move the polling place, and so things do happen, and we are trying to be as prepared as we can, and but if not, we have backup certainly with the State Board of Elections, and they have connections with all different types of agencies, so they can help.
What can be done to get people to get out and vote? The media, I work on single-payer health care, and I say to progressives...
Public County Public Library will close in 15 minutes.
We know that. Progressives don't want to go out to anybody that's different from themselves. You say you need to go and cross ethnic, class, and cultural boundaries by forming relationships with people in other communities who are different from you, and go and have them bring you in, work through storytelling to present information, because that creates a level playing field. And I'm sitting here thinking, so how do we increase the number of people to get out and vote? Because the media is not, the mainstream media, and of course now that it's becoming more and more and more corporatized to one group of people, is there anything
I don't think
done?
I asked you about what the turnout rates are in Tompkins County. I think that was one of the questions, but I don't think I got to.
Yeah, last year's presidential was 76%.
76%?
Yeah.
That's amazing. That's almost Minnesota.
Well,
it is Minnesota.
And there's a fair amount of people on the rolls there that were Cornell students that graduated and moved on, but we don't know where they moved. So we never even get the cards back. We mail out a card every year to every voter, and if they moved, they're supposed to come back to us. But if they go into a frat house, it's like a black hole. We never get the cards back. We don't know that they've moved on. But
so the 76%
is based on all the active voters, whether they're there or not.
And so that includes like a lot of students who have left. So it was probably upwards
includes
of
some, yeah.
80%.
I couldn't tell you how much, but
that's quite high.
Yeah.
I mean, American elections. So the history of turnout in the United States used to be quite high. That was a little there, like in the 19th century. There was probably some fraud involved in that, right? There are many places where it's suspiciously high, right? Like it's like 125% of
that's a problem.
of voters are turning out. But it declined a lot once you started having registration system. Before the late 19th century, there was no registration. One of the reasons it was easy to vote was you just went up and said, I live here. And said, prove it. He knows I live here. All right, there you go. Registration books dampen turnout. Things like the secret ballot dampened turnout, because the secret ballot operated in part as a literacy test, so people can turn out. When women's enfranchisement dampened turnout, because the first generation of women were less likely to vote than men. That quickly changed, and has now women are more likely to vote than men. And it decreased again after the voting age was lowered to 18. 19-year-olds were less likely to vote than 22-year-olds. And so it has gone down persistently up until around the last 10 years or so. Increased competition elections. One of the things that gets people out to vote is that people think the stakes are high. And so I think 2020 was the highest turnout election, despite, and maybe even because it was a pandemic. Right? One of the things that the pandemic did was lead a lot of states to make it easier to vote. Vote by mail, vote earlier, and stuff like that to spread it out. But also the stakes of the election were perceived as being quite high. And as that happened, more people turned out to vote. And so I think it was the highest turnout election since 1906. I don't know, pardon?
And what was it?
I mean, I couldn't tell you off the top of my head, but I'd be surprised if it was anywhere near 76. I expect it to be in the 60s, low 60s, right?
People don't feel, why should people feel invested? There's nothing to be invested in this country. Look at wage, look at lack of childcare.
And you might think also that the very lack of those things might lead people to be invested. Voting is one of those, like, people have studied turnout, and one of the things that they find is there are people who are just civically minded, and they tend to be civically minded across the board, right? They are the person who is also at the PTA. They are the person who is also in their co-op. They are just involved. Then there's people like me, who, I'm not a very social person. I try to hide from people as much as possible. But I feel a type of civic obligation to go. And then I have many students who aren't very civically involved and don't feel much obligation, but like politics, right? They like it in the same way that somebody might like football. Right? They find it exciting, so they want to participate. Once you get down below that, it can be a lot tougher to find people, to find a reason to vote. And I agree. Finding a reason for a lot of people to vote is difficult, in part because it's tough to connect with their material existence and their circumstances of their day-to-day life. But some places make it easy and some places make it difficult. New York State is making it easier. Minnesota makes it really easy. Mississippi makes it very difficult. And those also produce a type of culture. Minnesota has a lot of different organizations that come to you and say, come out to vote, come out to vote, come out to vote. If you remember 2020, you couldn't get a coffee at Starbucks without also being given a voter registration card. It felt like everyone was turning, that was exaggerated, but everyone was turning you out to vote. Like there was a real civil society or pressure around it. Not even pressure, but encouragement for it. One of the best ways that you can actually get people to vote is asking them. It's surprising. The most effective thing to get a voter from a non-voter, or a voter out of a non-voter, is to ask them to vote. Now, when I say effective, I don't mean like you ask them, they'll do it. But it's much more effective than sort of a campaign ad, or something like this. If you ask someone you know to vote, and then if you do the next step and say, here, I'll tell you the process. Here's the online form to get registered. Everything after that starts to become a little easier. Once you're registered, you're more likely to vote.
Also, if you give people access who do not have transportation, you make sure that's in effect. And like I said, people have to have support to be quote unquote educated about an issue, to have people that they feel care about them and that are willing to work with them, to give them the tools.
There's not much evidence to suggest that voters are more educated about issues than non-voters. It does have a lot to do with a type of commitment to civic life and participation. And it's easier if there are studies that find if you were accidentally living in Minnesota when you were 18 versus living in Mississippi, but you're from Connecticut and then you went back to Connecticut. And so you were in a high voting context place when you first had the chance to vote. You're much more likely to be a long-term voter. Getting people when they're young forms habits. It's much harder to get somebody who's 45, who's never voted, to vote than it is to get an 18-year-old to vote than to get a 30-year-old who used to vote again, right? If you have always voted and you just missed a few cycles, getting them back in. This is in part why the inactive versus, if you sort of drop out after several cycles kind of makes sense. These are very, very irregular voters. Any other parting questions before we get the boot?
So do you have the registration forms with you?
We do have registration forms here.
Yeah, they're right there on the table.
I registered myself. 18-year-olds got the register.
I still, I left Canada when I was when I was about 19. I voted in one Canadian election, and then I was unable to vote in the United States, and I was unable to vote in Canada until I became a citizen in 2022. And so, despite the fact that I study voting, and despite the fact that I study disenfranchisement, I had not been able to vote until 2023 in the local election.
Why did you come here? You would have had health care if you stayed there. I mean, you know, there is it's the worst of the worst, getting worse.
I mean, you're telling me what? Rubbing it in my face. No, I am very lucky to be here. Many ways.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank the two of you.
Thank you.
Seriously, what happens if there's a tornado?